Welcome to Creative Courage Chats, a search for a new understanding of creativity and problem solving. I'm Alex Raffy. Hi, everybody. I'm actually at my office right now doing Creative Courage. I was at work, and we're going to go and do a Creative Courage chat from here today. I'm here with Matt O'Brien, and we're going to have a discussion about creativity. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Tell us what you do. Hey, Alex, how you doing?
Good.
I'm Mathew O'Brien, born in Washington, D.C., grew up in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And actually, after college, I was living kind of a starving artist lifestyle in Atlanta. I was delivering a newspaper route in the afternoon, and then I would read at night and write in the mornings. Getting a history degree, I really became interested in writing and research, and after college, I continued that. But I was in my mid to late 20s and throwing a paper out and not really published at that point. And Vegas was becoming really popular at that point. It was in the mainstream consciousness quite a bit. I think the movie Swingers had come out right around that time. And
yeah,
you would read,
that's a great movie.
USA Today, or even in the newspaper I delivered, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, you would start seeing articles about Vegas, and not just the casinos, but what I call the real Las Vegas, how the city was growing and booming. And I ended up moving to Las Vegas in December of 1997 with my roommate. Never having been there, not knowing anyone there, didn't have a job lined up, just kind of packed our stuff, drove out there thinking we would stay, 6 months, a year, maybe a year or two. And I ended up staying 20 years in Las Vegas. And my roommate, Mark, is still in Las Vegas, actually. But when I was in Vegas, I continued to write short stories and try to write short novels. But to support my fiction habit, I started freelancing for newspapers like Las Vegas City Life and stringing sports for the Sun, and ended up being a journalist in Las Vegas for City Life for many years. Published quite a few books about not the Strip, but like the seedier side of Las Vegas. That was kind of my beat as a journalist, and I turned that beat into some books. But most recently, about 3 years ago, a job opportunity came up in Central America for me to teach down here. I'd got my MFA in creative writing from UNLV, and I taught at UNLV and got some teaching experience. So I moved to El Salvador about 3 years ago to teach at an English language prep school down here and to work on my latest book as well. So that's where I'm talking to you from now. I'm on the outskirts of San Salvador here.
Yeah, that's great.
In my home.
Yeah. So you've written a few books. Just writing one book is such a huge accomplishment. I'm always impressed with people that write multiple books because it's such a massive effort and energy required to drive. When do you know you have a book in you? I mean, how do you know when, what's the starting gun thing that happens? Is it like you hear someone say a thing and it's like, you know what, there's something there? Or does it take a long time to kind of have a feeling that eventually evolves into something that you think is worthy of your time to write?
Well, my first book, Beneath the Neon, started as newspaper articles in City Life. They were two cover stories that I co-wrote with my friend Josh Ellis. I, as managing editor of City Life, had heard about a murderer who used the underground flood channels of Las Vegas to evade the police. And I actually said it'd be cool if one of our reporters from City Life could maybe go down there and explore these tunnels. And I reached out to Josh. He was kind of a renegade freelance writer for us, kind of a bold, brave guy, and said, hey, you want to go explore these tunnels? And he said, yeah. So I checked in with him a few weeks later, and he told me he had explored one of these tunnels but wanted to see more of them, but he didn't have a car at the time. So I offered to pick him up over the weekend and drive him around to some tunnels. And I, of course, got involved in the story at that point. We were going into the tunnels together, and we decided to co-write these stories. But these went viral before that was really a term. They were posted on a lot of websites, kind of national websites,
Right.
and we received a lot of emails, a big response off these two stories we co-wrote. And that's when I realized that there might be more to this than just a newspaper story. And that's when I decided to expand those two stories into a book, Beneath the Neon.
Which is an interesting evolution, right? Where you're actually actively going after a curiosity, right? Which is this particular person in the tunnels, and you're going for this one thing, but in the process, it grew into something bigger, right? It grew, and that's usually kind of how it seems to happen. I just often wonder sometimes, due to because I mean the topic is kind of creativity. I usually kind of go a little off topic, but how many people have a curiosity or something that they're wondering? They're not a journalist, right? It's not like their job to actually come up with the stories, but they still have these curiosities. And how many people just kind of push them away because they're busy with something else? When you actually go after a curiosity, sometimes it opens up and becomes something totally different you didn't expect, right? Or it grows.
Exactly. I think curiosity is the key word in this case, because when I read the newspaper story about this murderer using the tunnels to avoid the police, I became really curious about what he experienced down there. I had these images of him kind of feeling his way through these dark tunnels and this water, kind of like the movie Fugitive, with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones, those kind of images. And then once Josh Ellis and I went down together and explored 4 or 5 tunnels, we found some interesting things, kind of weird, ironic debris that would wash into the tunnels, some pretty cool graffiti and artwork on the walls. But most interesting to me were people. We discovered homeless people living down in these tunnels, and that wasn't common knowledge at the time. And it's that curiosity about what else was down there that we didn't encounter, that we didn't explore, that drove me in large part to continue reporting that subject and writing that book, Beneath the Neon.
So yeah, as a journalist, then you've had a lot of experiences where you've gotten to interview a lot of different people. That's another thing. I think that we make assumptions sometimes about people and what they're about. And I often give the advice to people that if they see an old person sitting by themselves somewhere, start up a conversation with them, because I'm guaranteeing you're going to hear a good story or something, because everybody's got something in them that they need to tell and share. Have you found that individuals have a lot of stories to tell and everything? I'm sure you have through your career, right?
Yeah, definitely. And not just individuals, but being curious it's important as a journalist and as a person too. Like for me as a journalist, I thought, don't just walk by or drive by an underground flood channel. You see the darkness and then it kind of disappears. As a writer in particular, you need to be alert for those kind of things and say, hey, I'm going to take a flashlight and maybe just peek in there and see what's there. It actually made me wonder how many great stories I had overlooked in the past because I wasn't curious enough. I kind of ignored stuff instead of paying more attention to it. And as you're saying, that can apply to people too. How many times do we just kind of walk by someone or even sitting on a bus, right next to someone and not engaging them, not speaking.
Buses are actually a good example, because you could sit on a bus ride and look at somebody across the way and form an entire story about who that person is in your head based on what they're wearing or what they look like, these assumptions that you make in your head. So you as a writer and a journalist, right? Those are kind of similar but different fields, right? And nowadays, journalism is perceived by a large part of the community as something specific, whether it's, that term fake news is constantly coming up and stuff. But as a journalist and as a writer, I mean, how do you see those roles? Do they overlap a little bit? Are they completely separate? I mean, how would you, when you approach, do you approach your fictional stories, or in the past, like a journalist, do you use the same skill set, or are there different methods? Is there as much research done? How do you go about doing this?
Yeah, well, that's a kind of a heavy, pretty big question there. But as
Yeah.
I told you, I originally started out, writing fiction, writing short stories, and then I got into journalism to support my creative writing. But then I ended up being a journalist for many years, just writing nonfiction. The good thing about working at City Life, it was, I don't know if you remember
Oh
City
yeah,
Life.
very, very much so. It was
Yeah, it
great,
was
great
like an
publication.
alternative weekly
Yeah.
newspaper. It wasn't traditional journalism, so we were encouraged.
It literally my favorite thing to read in town was that
Yeah,
magazine. Yeah.
it had its moments for sure, and
Yeah.
especially being a young writer at a publication like that, where you're really encouraged to experiment with your writing. It's not just straight journalism. You can tell a story. You can experiment with structure and style, and that was really a great training ground for me, being a freelancer at City Life and then working there so many years full time, and just being allowed to, yes, to learn how to report and do research, but how to present it in a unique and interesting way. So I've published, nonfiction, fiction, poetry. So I've really tried to pride myself on being a versatile writing. And to finally answer your question, I think they all feed off each other to a certain extent. Journalism, fiction, poetry. Journalism, you do research. I think to write good fiction, you need to do your share of research as well. And then I like to write poetry just to work on the language that I would use in fiction, that rich, unique wording that you need to make writing come alive. So I think they're all different, but they all overlap and feed off each other in some way too.
So I had an interview with Liz Donnelly, who's the editorial cartoonist for the New Yorker, or a cartoonist for the New Yorker. And one of the questions I asked her, I'm going to ask you, because it's kind of in the same vein, that editorial cartooning isn't journalism, but it's attached to journalism because it's usually stories that were, within it, and it's an opinion about what it is. It's like an editorial, well, that's editorial cartoon. But what I was asking her is, when you're working on a story, is it coming from you or is it coming from outside of you? Like when you're considering the reader, do you want them to know you're the one writing the story, or are they reading something that's coming from the paper, like a voice from the paper? Does that make any sense to you?
A little bit. I think I know what you're getting at. Kind of voice and perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Is that what you're talking about there?
Well, yeah. In terms of, I don't know. Whenever if I'm painting a painting that's for me, it's me that I'm painting. It's coming out of me. But if I'm writing about like a blog about something on marketing or something like that, I don't think the voice is coming from me. It's coming from a perspective that I want people. I don't want people to think of me. I just want them to think about the topic.
Sure.
Like it's coming from.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's so vague.
Oh, no, now that you word it that way, I can connect to it a little bit more. And my answer would be, it really depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a personal essay that's by and from Matthew O'Brien with my voice, my story, obviously that's coming directly from me. But most of my background is getting the stories from other people and sharing them with an audience. For instance, my latest book, Dark Days, Bright Nights, Surviving the Las Vegas Storm Drains, it's a follow-up to my first book. The first book, Beneath the Neon, I explored the underground flood channels. It was a first-person narrative where I wrote, shared my observations on Las Vegas from this unique perspective below the city. And then the conversations that I had with the homeless people down there as well. This book, Dark Days, Bright Nights, I interviewed 35 people that made it out of these tunnels and got off the drugs and quit gambling and turned around their lives. So this is an oral account of their stories. And I went all the way back to the beginning. I asked them all, what was your earliest memory? Then we talked a little bit about their childhood and high school and kind of young adulthood, working all the way up to Las Vegas, homelessness, living in the tunnels, getting out, getting clean, the lessons they learned. So I'm kind of like intermediate between these people who have these incredible stories and the reader who may be interested in
Right.
these topics there.
It's so, it just sounds so important too, because we're talking about the underground tunnels. I mean, I've heard it and I've read some of your stuff about it, and it's this dark, scary thing, right? That people, in their minds, they're like, oh, how horrible must it be? But then you bring some humanity to it by talking about the people, and then it becomes relatable, right? Because then anybody can see how, you know, these people are trying to just make it through, and then this is shelter. This is a place, and they can sort of. I know that they figured out a whole power system under the tunnels, right, where people can have lights, and they've got like microwave ovens, and they've got almost little apartments, right? They've got like down there, and it's this total other world. But from the layman's perspective, it's these dark people that are roaming around in the darkness, and it's scary, and it's but I love that you're bringing life to something that some people are afraid of. That's a really important, must be satisfying.
But honestly, Alex, when I first went into the tunnels, we're talking about 2002. I had done some writing on homelessness. I had covered that beat for City Life a little bit, but I had never really interacted that much with homeless people. So going into the tunnels at first was a pretty frightening experience. And
Right.
I was assuming the people I would encounter down there would be kind of the worst of the homeless population, mentally ill. Maybe I wouldn't.
Crazy people.
Violent, perhaps. Yeah. And it was interesting getting.
It's like a Mad Max down there.
Yeah. And I was, I went down on edge, man.
Right.
I had an expandable baton, a foam handle that when you flick it, a steel rod.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
kept down in the
I would too. I don't blame you for that. Yeah.
Early on, I would keep one hand kind of back there on a regular basis, and then you start engaging with these people, and one of them was a chef at a 4-star resort on the Strip, where one was a construction worker, another guy was an artist, a musician, and you start meeting these people, and just realizing how many things you have in common with them was very eye-opening, hopefully for the reader, but certainly for me as well. And that's a big goal with my latest book, is to kind of, like I was saying, most people don't know a homeless person. They've never really associated or been friends with a homeless person or even interacted with them. So in this book, I wanted to look back on what are the root causes of homelessness? What, is it related to the childhood, education? How does someone become homeless? What is that life really like? And then most importantly for this book, which I wasn't able to address in my first book, was how do you get out of that situation? What's the mindset you need to be in? What are the resources that need to be available to you? Do you have to hit that rock bottom, or is there something going on in your life that makes you want to change? Right. And those kind of things I really wanted to, as you say, kind of humanize not just these individual people, but the whole issue of homelessness.
Yeah, it's unintentionally. I'm saying unintentionally because I'm just making an assumption here, but unintentionally a very noble thing, to be the champion of empathy in a sense, where you're going out there and you're sharing these. You're kind of revealing something to someone. You're showing behind the curtain on something, a curtain that people are too scared to get past most of the time, but they can do it in the safety of their home by opening a magazine, right? So, and I think that's incredibly important. I think that I've always kind of had a lot of respect. I've known a lot of journalists and people, and the pursuit of the craft. I think it's a noble pursuit. I'm kind of very agitated by kind of the nonsense that's going on about the perception of journalism now, and the way people are not seeing the value. And it's just like anything else, sure, there's a couple of things that people made mistakes on, but you need to grow up. I mean, you can't just paint everything with a broad brush on this thing. You need to be able to see the value and lift up the good stuff. and just push away the stuff that's nonsense, right? I'm feeling like that lately people are losing touch with common sense, for lack of critical thinking and common sense, which is, how are we supposed to survive without these stories? We need these stories. We need, they're records of our lives. They're records of our history. People 100 years from now, where are they going to learn about stuff until they pick up an old magazine or a newspaper or look at an article online or wherever it's archived? Because nowadays not a lot of ink is being made. I mean, it's still out there, but most of the stuff's being written online now, right? So, but it's just these things are important, and I think that a lot of times, and they're demotivating, especially for young people who are nostalgic for the days before all the crazy stuff started happening. I worry a lot about the young people now that are kind of seeing the chaos we're going through, and they're devaluing important things traditionally that are being perceived so poorly now. Not even just talking about science. But
in my works, in my books, I do try to raise awareness about homelessness, but I try not to be preachy. I try not to tell people, I let the stories kind of speak for themselves. And in this latest book, I didn't just talk about the incredible success stories. That's a big part of the book, but also the failures, in recovery and what can go wrong. And then I like for the reader to judge these stories on their own, and then kind of reevaluate their stance on homelessness and homeless people and how they interact with them. So that's the approach I try to take.
Yeah, it's ironic to me, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, that before we talked, that you said that you don't see yourself as creative. I think that's insanity. It's just because it's so, everything you say is within the realms of a professional creative. Everything that you do is connected to what a creative does, is that kind of stuff. But
sure.
but they're also humble. Creatives are also very humble, and that's kind of another side of it too.
I was defining that term a little differently and kind of comparing myself to other writers I know or that I've read who really, their writing I consider super imaginative. And as I told you, my writing, a lot of it comes from other people. I'm sharing their stories. I'm working on some fiction now, some short stories that are set in Las Vegas. My last 4 or 5 years living there, I just wrote down a bunch of short story ideas. Some were just little scenes, that stood out to me there. And now I'm finally getting the time to go back into this story idea file and write some of these out. But the one I just finished a first draft of, I had known a guy in the streets, actually from the tunnels and the streets, named Steve. And he had shared with me a story about the dispute he had with another homeless guy. And it turned into this big story of revenge. This other homeless guy ended up punching Steve's girlfriend, Catherine, in the face. And so now Steve has to get back at him. It's just the rules of the street, and this is a younger guy he has to get back at, about half his age. And so you have these themes of the complications of revenge and aging and stuff like that. And Steve, I remember him sitting down with me. I would buy him a meal at McDonald's and get him some food, and he would share these stories and I would take notes. So I do take some artistic license, some creative license with these stories. They're labeled as fiction, and I can do that. But again, it's not me coming up with these stories out of my head typically. It's kind of sharing a story that it's someone else had passed along to me.
Well, I just think it's encouraging for anybody listening that is maybe curious about expanding on their writing or going a little deeper in their writing, to even understand that people that are at your level who've done a lot of experience in interviewing people and writing their own stories and stuff like that, you're still searching. You're still always searching about this stuff, and it's all about the content and developing the content. Like my favorite poet is Bukowski, right? And I love reading his work. But to be honest, one of the most beautiful things that he could write, it's just a reflection of life that we experience. The reason we love it is because it's relatable and because we've experienced similar things. We just haven't put it in writing, right? So you experience these beautiful stories and these interesting stories and intriguing stories from these people that are homeless underground. And you could take that experience and just communicate it in through one of your stories or even in a poem. and then somebody can relate to it in a certain way. I just think it's interesting that we look at art and we look at creativity and things like poetry, and we think that it gets plucked out of the sky, like from some magical god of poetry that just handed it over to us, and then we were able to just, and in fact, it came from life. It just came from the most common things. That it's just the way you look at things. It's just the way that you decide how deep am I going to go into this idea or this experience and try to really see what it felt like. And then that's why we love it, because we can relate to that same thing.
Yeah, I'm a Bukowski fan too, and now that I'm thinking about his work, I would never define his poetry as imaginative. The
Right.
idea, it's very narrative, right? He would
Right.
get stories from his life and the streets, but his language was very creative.
Oh, yeah, beautiful.
Right? So you have two kind of different types of creativity that we're talking about here. Very creative with the diction, the word choice that he would use.
And it's so relatable. It just feels like it's coming out of you. You know what I mean? I don't know.
True. Yeah, it's more accessible than a lot of poetry, but very beautiful at the same time. I had never heard of Bukowski when I moved to Las Vegas in 1997, but one of the first jobs I had in Vegas was for Manpower. Do you know that temp agency?
Yeah.
They focus on like manual labor work. So a lot of the work I did through Manpower was like at construction sites or at schools, moving classrooms from one side of the school to the other. And I remember I was at an office building with another Manpower worker, kind of an tall African-American guy with glasses, wearing a knit cap. And he was at one end of a desk and I was at the other end of a desk, and we were moving it somewhere else in the office. And we were talking a little bit about ourselves. And I said, I'm a writer. And he said, like Bukowski? And I said, who? And he told me a little bit about Charles Bukowski.
Yeah.
And I wrote it down. I remember I wrote it down on my notepad and went immediately to one of the used bookstores in Vegas on my way home from this job and picked up a couple of Bukowski titles. And he was a big influence on my work in my late 20s and early 30s. And I remain a fan of.
You're like the third male writer I've spoken to who has been influenced by the man. I mean, that's quite, especially a guy who didn't really even become, seriously looked at as a poet or a writer until even older than me. I think he's like in his 50s, right? I mean, it was like a long time before anybody really started paying attention to the guy.
Yeah, you probably know he worked for the post office for many years.
Yeah.
One of the first books I read from him was that novel, Post Office, based on his, again, not a super creative or imaginative book. It was based on his life as a delivery man.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. I think it's accessible. It's the work is written beautifully, right? Which makes it special. But the content is so relatable. It reminds me a little bit of Neruda, who is another poet I love. Is probably my second favorite poet. I don't know. They kind of are like this sometimes, and work depends on the day, right? In the piece, but Neruda talks about his love for a woman and how deep it is, and how I think the line is something like, "Your hand on my chest, I love you so deeply that your hand on my chest is my hand," right? So and I kind of think of that when I read Bukowski, because it's so when he's describing things. I feel like I was there, and like I know what he was feeling when he wrote that, and and a lot of times, sometimes like that's with art, I think is a really special kind of thing, but in journalism and writing, I think that's also important. And I'm saying journalism, even though it's not considered an art form because it's based on fact, but it's still communication, and there's still an eloquence of language that needs to be used to help carry people through a story in an interesting way, to keep them wanting to read and to keep them to realizing. And there is very little difference. It's just than it is when communicating art, is because you're still communicating a story. This is just a specific story. You're not making it up. It's real. And you're just finding a way to communicate it. When we're writing fiction, you're making up the story, but you're still finding a way to communicate it, right? So it's like, so there's a lot of crossovers and similarity and everything like that. And it's just, go ahead.
I really like Neruda as well, and I love that his love poems, as you alluded to, are very beautiful, but he writes some great political stuff.
Oh yeah, that's why he's not with us anymore.
The long poem he wrote about the history of South America, right? I think Americans would pronounce it Canto General,
Yeah.
but Canto General.
Yeah.
Beautiful, work, very political. Kind of reminds me of Marvin Gaye, to really jump somewhere else here. Marvin Gaye could write the beautiful love songs, and then get really political with his lyrics.
Yeah, one of the best political songs ever was What's Going On, right? I mean, that to me, it's funny because I'm a punker from the early days. I was raised on that music. I loved that music in the 80s, and I was into punk rock. That song is punk rock. People don't realize it, but it's not about the style of music, it's the content. And that was an incredibly brave song to write at the day when he wrote it,
Are you a Raymond Carver fan?
Raymond Carver? No, I'm not. I don't know.
Because you've mentioned two writers that I'm a fan of, Bukowski and Neruda.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wondered if you were a fan of Raymond Carver too. He's an American short story writer, realism. I think he wrote maybe starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Very well known and famous. So you may want to check out his work.
Yeah.
I think you would like it.
Yeah, I got a vacation coming up next week, so I'll pick it up for my trip. I'll read some of that. That'd be great. Thank you for that tip. Yeah. So are you working on anything right now?
Well, I'm getting ready to promote the book Dark Days, Bright Nights. It's available for pre-order now, and it should be in bookstores in the next month or so. But I've started writing out these short stories that I mentioned, ideas that I had in Vegas that I'm getting a chance to write out. I've finished 3 short stories that are set in Vegas about kind of the real life there. Some of the themes, general themes, are homelessness, drug abuse, their relationships, stuff like that. So I have several more story ideas, and I'm going to start submitting these to literary journals to try to get them published, and who knows, maybe it could lead to another book for me down the road. But that's what I'm working on now, a collection of short stories that are set in Las Vegas.
It's important, I think, to get people to just hear these kinds of things, because I think that's a portion of the community that a lot of people ignore, and it's unfortunate that we're not thinking in terms of how to progress rather than shun certain people in the community. I think, I don't know, I work with a philosophy professor who deals with a lot of drug abuse, people who are formerly using drugs. They're now in jail for whatever reason, and they're addicted and everything, and who are in jail, and he goes in there and he does counseling. And I work with him a little bit. We talk about stuff. He's putting together a book too, for people, specifically for people in jail to read, stories that he's kind of come together and put together and stuff. So I think that's great. And again, I think it's noble work that you do, and putting these stories out there and helping people learn a little bit about this stuff. Whenever I interview people, and I've said this a lot of times, that you fall into the category of people that I like to talk to, because I see you as a solution as a creative, as a solution to the bigger problems in the world, in the terms of being an active creative and putting things out there and sharing your abilities with the world, is putting good things into the world that other people will be influenced by, and hopefully do the same thing. And it's like a chain reaction going forward. My hope is that there's people that are listening that are curious about writing, younger people that are maybe listening. What kind of advice would you give to yourself when you were a young writer? Like, what to expect? What are maybe some things that like, if you could meet yourself as a young person curious about writing, what kind of things would you say to yourself?
I would probably tell myself, be patient. It's a long journey as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth it, but I think every young writer thinks you're immediately going to have success. You're immediately going to get published.
Right.
You're immediately going to make money, a lot of money, and you're immediately going to be well known and famous. And it doesn't typically work that way. But really, if you want to be a writer, it's not a conscious decision. If you're sitting down and like okay, do I want to be a writer? What are the pros and cons? Here are the pros, here are the cons. If that's something you have to do, you're not really meant to be a writer. You don't want to be a writer. It's something that you really don't have, in my experience, have a decision in. It just kind of happens and you do the best you can with it. So another thought, though, related to something that you said early on as a journalist, I was very aware of, yeah, let's raise awareness, but you don't want to get too involved. You know, you want to remain objective, right? I'm sure you're familiar with that in journalism. But what happened is very interesting with Beneath the Neon. When I kind of befriended a lot of people in the tunnels, I would go back for follow-up interviews and check on them. And these people were so open with me. I walked into their home, basically, uninvited. And, you know, a lot of times they invited me to sit down and would speak for 2 or 3 hours. And I was able to publish a book with their stories in it. So for the first time in my career, I kind of did what I felt was overstepping the bounds. And I started a community project to help these people down in the tunnels. It's called Shine a Light, you know, borrowed from the Rolling Stones song. And it started out as just kind of very grassroots, run out of my home in Las Vegas. I would go down with bottled water or canned food and kind of give it out, and really just mainly listen to the people, be someone who was supportive of them and would help them in any way I can. And then the community would get involved. They would donate clothes to me, water, and I would take the stuff down to them. And it's interesting that now when I moved to Central America, I passed the program off to Freedom House Sober Living, and they've turned this into like an official nonprofit program and are getting funding for it. And a lot of people that used to live in the tunnels are kind of running and managing this program, and they've housed like 60 people in the past year or so. So I would also say to my younger self, like, you know, don't worry so much about objectivity and try to get maybe a little more involved in the issues. I read a Salvadorian poet recently. Rocky Dalton is his name. He's a pretty prominent international poet. And he was a poet and a revolutionary. And he felt it wasn't enough just to write about that life. You had to be about that. You had to live that life.
Right.
And I think I'm coming around to that philosophy more and more.
Yeah, I think patience is a big part of it too, isn't it? I mean, you know, I think that there's a problem with the instant gratification that we get nowadays, you know, and we just live in a world of convenience already. But when it comes to our careers, I think that sometimes people expect things to happen quickly, and when it's hard to be an artist or a writer who writes something and you're thinking, wow, that was really good. I put everything I had into that. And then it's done. And then like, you got to wake up the next morning and write something else. It's sometimes people, and if nothing happens with that amazing thing that you put out into the world, it's hard to motivate yourself to get back up and do it again, and then get back up and do it again. And one of the things that I think that it's important, and I've kind of thought, I brought it up before, is that if you're a creator, your job is to create things. Your job is to put things out into the world with everything you've got. Put as much of you and everything you can get into it. And then that's it. It's gone. And once it's gone and it's done, it doesn't exist anymore. Now you got to keep working on other things and put out new things. And the importance isn't on the story that you're writing. The importance that you should put on it is your ability to write it, who you are. You're growing every time you do something and you create something, you grow. And the energy needs to put towards you. I don't know. That's what I hear when I hear you talk about things, and I'm thinking in terms of being a young person who's looking to reach a higher level, and who's right here right now. It's like, what is the motivator to keep me going and to keep me going and to keep me going? And I think that you kind of shifting over into going beyond the objectivity of the thing, and putting a little bit of yourself and trying to solve a particular problem that you saw, putting your energy into solving that particular problem, probably fed you even more as you went forward, right? Because you saw that working out. So,
and you made me think of one thing I really love about writing and journalism. I didn't mean to sound too negative and discouraging of young writers. One thing I really loved about journalism is, like, approaching a subject that you maybe know very little or nothing about,
Right.
and trying to become an expert in that in maybe 2 days, depending on your deadline, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So coming into a subject knowing very little, and then coming out of it feeling like you have a really solid grip and that you've learned a lot about it, it's something I really liked about, working at City Life and just freelance journalism as well.
That's great. So listen, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Matt. Hope you enjoyed the chat. I know these are kind of, we're just having a conversation and putting it out there. But thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. Take care.